continuing with 2.1. But yesterday, when we were working with our transformations of quadratic functions, we were working with the situation where I gave you the graph and said, tell me what's happening. Today, I'm giving you an equation and I'm telling you what's going to happen to it, and I'm asking you to change the equation. Again, we did this back in chapter 1. We're just focusing more in on the quadratics. Now, the instructions are going to be a little bit odd on this section, at least in my opinion, because it's going to tell you to write a rule for G. Described by the transformation of the graph F. And then ID the vertex, or identify the vertex. Now, essentially what this is telling us to do is telling us to write an equation, g of x, that has performed the transformations described on the function I give you, f of x. Now, sometimes the function that's going to be given to you is going to be the parent function. In this case, f of x is equal to x squared. At all times, it's going to be a quadratic function in this chapter. Not going to switch it up by doing quadratic and absolute value and constants and linears. We're just going to stick with quadratic. Now, there is a slight difference that you're going to see in these instructions compared to what was happening in chapter 1. Now, to this function, we're going to do a horizontal shrink factor of 1/2. We're going to translate right 6 and up 2. And here's where a slight change is going to happen. Now we're going to introduce the words followed by. And it's going to tell you what it's going to do next. A reflection across the x-axis is going to be what this one is followed by. Now, generally speaking, when we're working with these problems that are quadratic, our goal is to kind of keep that vertex form with the slight shift of there might be a b involved. But as we do that, essentially the things you got to keep in mind is where a, where h, where k, and then also where b would go. A gets multiplied by the front, in front of the parentheses. B gets multiplied in front of the x. H gets put inside the parentheses, and K goes out at the very end, outside the parentheses. H and K being added, A and B being multiplied. Horizontal shrink. Which variable is that affecting? A, B, H, or K? B. Translation right 6. A, B, H, or K? H. Up to K. Now, when you have these situations where it does something and then it's followed by something else, you want to do this in pieces. Start with the stuff that it says before followed by. So we're going to do the horizontal shrink, the factor of 1/2, translating right, 6, and up 2. So we're going to do those 3 things first. Horizontal shrink, factor of 1/2. What do I put into the equation? A 2 in the b value, because remember the horizontal stretches and shrinks, you always have to do their reciprocals. You always got to flip it. Horizontal shrink factor of 1/2 is telling us we are going to put a 2 in for b. Specifically, directly before the x. Now, when it's in vertex form, another thing I want you to remember is where that squared goes. Do you notice it goes outside the parentheses? If you move it inside the parentheses, you've got a very different problem. Make sure it goes outside the parentheses. Do you notice that this original equation didn't have parentheses involved? It was just x squared. That is x in parentheses squared. So when I put that 2 there, I'm going to put the 2 directly in front of the x, and I know there's going to be parentheses involved. Now before I close the parentheses, I double check. We said there was an h, right? That was the right 6. Is that plus or minus to move right? Minus. So I'm going to do the -6. Then I'm going to close the parentheses, and I'll put the squared on there, and the up 2 was the k value. When it's up, is it plus or minus? Plus. Plus 2. So I do all of those things to my function at once to kind of get this. Now, at this point, I would simplify if possible. Are there any things that like combine at this point? So that's really the only simplifying you're going to come across. No, nothing really combines. So there we go. Now I have to do the followed by. The reason I have to do this afterwards is when you do the followed by, now you're making the edits to this equation. Remember last chapter where I told you to essentially put that equation that you were working with in parentheses to do the things to it? We still kind of had that A, B, H, and K. We have to do that, particularly if A gets involved. That's where the biggest reason why we need those parentheses involved is because after you have a more complex function, if you do anything with A, it does something to everything. The B, the H, the K, they don't necessarily mess with as many things, but A does. A reflection across the x-axis. How do you reflect? What do you put into the equation? A negative. Across the x-axis, is that an A or a B? Yeah. So now I have to put a negative right here. I have to do it after I've done everything else, because otherwise it's not going to affect everything like it's supposed to. Which in the followed by situation, it's supposed to affect all of it. Do we generally leave a number, in this case a -1, sitting in front of a set of parentheses? No, we distribute it. Can I distribute a negative into a squared? No, I just put it in front of it. Negative in front of the 2x minus 6 squared. I distribute it all the way over to the 2, and I get -2. Now I've done all of my things. Now that is my g of x. I have to do it in pieces. in general, in chapter 1, I told you to put those parentheses there to kind of hold things together. Overall, you really only absolutely need them if you're changing A. Okay. This is our main focus today. So, I'm going to do just a couple more examples, and then my goal is to get you plenty of work time to get some practice on your own. Second problem says f of x is equal to the quantity x minus 2 squared plus 3. That's a semicolon, by the way, to separate things, in case you're wondering. Translated right 1 and down 6, followed by a vertical shrink factor 1/3 and a reflection across the x-axis. So, I do it in pieces. The stuff before the followed by first. Translated right 1, down 6. Right 1. A, B, H, or K. H. It's going inside the parentheses is the key thing you need to know. If you don't remember what letter it is, right is inside the parentheses, adding or subtracting. Right is subtracting. Okay? Down 6. A, B, H, or K. K. If you don't remember it's K, the key thing you need to know, up and down is outside the parentheses. Down is minus. Do you notice there wasn't an A involved? At least not yet. Which means if you don't want to put the parentheses, you don't have to put the parentheses. I've got this x minus 2 squared plus 3. A is not involved. B is not involved. A goes inside, or sorry, not A. H goes inside the parentheses. K goes outside the parentheses. H we said was right 1, so we're gonna minus 1. K we said was down 6, which was minus 6. X minus 2 minus 1 in parentheses squared plus 3 minus 6. Can I simplify any of that? Yeah, I don't need to leave minus 2 minus 1 or plus 3 minus 6. X minus 3 squared and then a minus 3. Now I do the second piece. The second piece said followed by vertical shrink factor 1/3 and a reflection across the x-axis. Vertical shrink. A, B, H, or K? A. Again, the big thing you need to know is that goes way up front and is getting multiplied. And if you do it to one thing, you do it to all of it for A. Reflection across the x-axis. A, B, H, or K? A. Both of these are affecting A. When the factor is 1/3, what am I putting in for A? It's vertical. When it's vertical, it's whatever the number was there. What you're putting in for A is 1/3. It's when it's horizontal. That's when you're flipping it. That's when you have to do that reciprocal, is when it's horizontal shrink or stretch. When it's vertical, it's that number. It's telling you A is going to be 1/3, but furthermore, the reflection across the x-axis is telling you A is going to be negative. So in the very front, I'm putting negative 1/3. Since I have to do it to everything because it's an A, I'm putting everything that I got in parentheses, and then I'm putting the negative 1/3. Do I typically leave a number in front of a set of parentheses? No, I distribute it. Now when I distribute it, it hits another parentheses. But that parentheses is squared. You can't touch it. So the negative 1/3 just sits in front of it. Negative 1/3 times a negative 3. First off, negative times a negative. That part you should know without the calculator. Positive. 1/3 times 3 is 1. If you don't know how to multiply fractions, you change them both into fractions. You put that over 1, you multiply straight across the top. 3 over 3, 1. I've done all of the things, so I call it g of x. That's my final function. That's my rule g. Wait a second. Have we skipped a piece of the instructions?
Yeah.
Have we identified the vertex? So we have to do that. I'm going to start actually identifying the vertex with this one just because it's a little bit easier, just to bring us in there a little bit. Yesterday we talked about in vertex form. When it is in this form with A, H, and K, the vertex is at HK. And I told you, be careful. If the original function has a minus, then what's it telling me to do with my H? Do the opposite number of what's there. So on this one, it's a minus 3. Opposite of minus 3 is positive 3. The K had a plus sign. You don't need to do the opposite. It was positive 1, so it's going to be 1. That's my vertex. Now I wanted to start with this one because this one's got a B involved. We talked about it yesterday. B messes with the vertex. Vertex form does not have a B involved. To get that B out of there, I have to essentially factor it out of that piece. Focus on that 2x minus 6. Get that B out of there. In other words, divide this out of both pieces. When I divide 2 out of that entire thing, I'm left with x and minus 3. Now that doesn't actually change my equation. My equation still stays this. It just helps me identify the vertex. I focus on this piece for the h of the vertex. If this is an x minus 3 here, the vertex's x value is positive 3. Because remember, you're still doing that opposite piece. Okay, I got a minus 2 right here. Negative 2. Okay, I've got one final example. Horizontal stretch factor of 2 followed by a translation left 3. Horizontal stretch comes first. It's horizontal, which tells me to do what with the factor it gives me. Flip it. Instead of 2, I'm going to put in 1/2. Where does horizontal go? Inside or outside the parentheses? Inside being multiplied. Where the heck are my parentheses? They are around specifically the x. If you don't see parentheses, then the parentheses are just holding on to the x. They're holding on to absolutely nothing else. So this is technically my original. So right there is where I'm putting the 1/2. Can I simplify this at all? And by simplify, I mean, is there something to distribute or combine like terms in this case? No. Those cannot be touched until you deal with the square, and we're leaving the vertex form, which means we're leaving the square on the parentheses. We're not doing anything else with it at this point. Is there things we could do? Technically, yes. You can square the 1/2, square the x, because there's no addition or subtraction, you can do that. If there was adding or subtracting, you couldn't do that. But there's no plus or minus here in the parentheses. You could square both of these and then simplify some things down, but since we're leaving this in a vertex-ish form, we're gonna leave it. Okay, I've done that. Now I need to translate left 3. A, H, K, or B? H, which means in or outside the parentheses. Inside. Adding or subtracting for left? Adding. Inside, I need to add 3. 4, parenthesis, 1/2 x plus 3, close that square, plus 1. Nothing will combine, nothing will simplify, that is my function. Let's finish it off by finding the vertex. Do you notice there's a B on there? The B messes with the vertex. To deal with that, we focus just on this piece and factor it out. In other words, we divide it out and put it out front. 1/2 x divided by 1/2 should be an easy one. X. What is 3 divided by 1/2? 6. It is 6. To divide by a fraction is to multiply by its reciprocal. 3 divided by 1/2, which you can use a calculator for. 3 divided by, now if you're going to do a fraction, put it in parentheses. Or if you know that a 1/2 is 0.5, you can do it that way. Either way, 3 divided by 1/2 is 6. It didn't say divide in half, it said divide by 1/2, and those are different. What is my vertex? -6, +1. Opposite of that, same as that.